Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Music Podcast. I'm your host, Rory O'Toole. Hope you guys have done well since the last episode went up this past Sunday, But even in the few days between now and the release of this new episode, a lot has been happening in the music world because in this day and age, music just keeps going. There's always so much being released all the time. Even in this moment where artists can't even tour in support of their albums or projects, in a way it seems like artists are actually being more productive in some respects because they have all this time on their hands. They have a lot of time to think. They don't have the distractions maybe of touring, which takes up so much energy, obviously, and it's not like they're going to parties. At least I hope they're not, due to social distancing guidelines. I hope they're not. I don't think there's as much distractions right now for artists and musicians. I mean, we've seen it with people like Taylor Swift, who had the surprise album that she was able to release kind of due to the freak occurrence of this pandemic shutting everything down, because before that she was just planning to tour in support of her latest album, Lover, in 2019. So you're kind of seeing that across the board with other artists who are just sort of using this time to either clear out their back catalog, release some songs that they had previously left unfinished or uninspired, or it was just kind of half thought out. Now they've had time to really complete those songs, or it's been a great opportunity for some original creations, and obviously gives time to certain bands or musical communities to kind of hunker down in their own sound, their own sort of scene, and work with each other. Or, I mean, the Zoom meeting is not just productive for us. I'm sure there's lots of Zoom meetings going on between different artists, producers, record labels, trying to coordinate all this and trying to make a positive out of what has been a largely negative year and a negative period. In a way, this is the ultimate moment to flesh out those ideas that you've had in the back of your mind for a long time, or complete those ideas that you never had time for before, because now all you have is time, which is great because we're getting some great music as a result. And speaking of the pandemic world that we are currently living in, we are all spending a lot of time on streaming platforms, streaming services like Netflix, like Hulu, and like Disney Plus, which on July 31st released the Beyonce film Black is King, which is not a new album per se, but is essentially a visual album of Beyonce's project for The Lion King called The Gift. It's basically a companion tie-in visual album that was curated for the film. Now, some of the songs off the 2019 album aren't included in Black is King, but some songs that weren't included before are included on this, actually, so you kind of get a trade for some certain songs for others that were previously unheard or included on the deluxe edition but not on the standard album, which is really cool. And obviously, whenever Beyonce drops a project, it is just pandemonium on social media and on the internet in general. She is one of the few cultural forces that can get people to stop what they're doing and go rush to Twitter and rush to listen to her album, or in this case, watch this film. And what I want to talk about with Black is King is not just about the film itself, because, hey, this is not a movie podcast, this is a music podcast. And in that light, I want to talk about Black is King and the future of the visual album. Now, we know Beyonce is kind of at the forefront of the visual album tradition and innovation. We've seen it with her self-titled album, I believe in 2013, maybe somewhere thereabouts. She had a visual album for that. Obviously, Lemonade was released on HBO as a visual album. And now here, Black is King, we get the zenith of her visual album ambitions, because this is definitely the most ambitious, most colorful, most extravagant, most just bombastic version of a visual album you could ever get. It honestly feels like the golden age of Hollywood, when they would do these biblical epics and just spend obscene amounts of money on costumes and sets and design and all these extras, like something out of 1940s golden age Hollywood. That's what you have, 1930s. This is what you have with Black is King. The amount of costumes, the amount of sets, the amount of just sheer time, energy, money that went into this is something that very few artists can justify that sort of investment in, but obviously Beyonce is a rare case, and she's able to pull that off quite easily. And I think Disney is happy to spend the amount of money, because look, they get to add Beyonce to their own catalog, and it's just a prestige thing for Disney Plus to draw in more subscribers and such. And yeah, once you watch this thing, it's like the most expansive music video you could ever imagine times 10. It's just full of color, energy, and you can't help but think lots and lots and lots of money, which is great for Beyonce, because it allowed her to realize her vision on this. And Beyonce, like I said, she stands at the center of so many powerful parts of pop culture and art. She's a cultural touchstone who also sells lots of records, which, not everyone can say. Sometimes it's easier to be an activist than commercially successful, or vice versa. You're commercially successful but not taken seriously as a voice for a community or voice for a political perspective. But Beyonce, with this film, is clearly making a political statement, especially has sort of vague allusions to Pan-Africanism and the definitely heavy focus on the African diaspora and sort of the idea of unifying all these people who have African ancestry or are just in Africa but were divided up by, obviously, the colonial history of Africa, which sort of separated the continent into different fiefdoms of Europe. And now we even still have the legacy of that today, where the country, it's hard for them to unify because they're speaking different languages and have different interests, and a lot of those were influenced heavily by their colonial past, and even just the mindset of the people. It's very much still, the legacy of colonialism is quite strong there. So this is sort of a back to our roots approach to not only African American experience, but to the African diaspora experience writ large, and the present African domestic experience. And like I said, this is from The Lion King, The Gift, but it's less about the story of Lion King than it is about sort of showcasing and celebrating African culture. There's a real Baz Luhrmann kind of Great Gatsby sense to it too, with just how extravagant it is. It is, I mean, I feel like I'm not doing it justice. It is the definition of extravagance. And, you know, Beyonce, with this approach to Pan-Africanism and getting in touch with her African roots, this is just a long line of tradition of African-American figures who go back to Malcolm X, Nina Simone, Muhammad Ali, James Brown, who kind of revisit the mythical land of their ancestors in Africa and try to subvert the internalized racism and oppression they feel that they've been essentially raised in, to create a new identity for themselves that is rooted in the glorious past of Africa, which is very much clear in this album, where you have lots of, obviously the main arc of The Lion King is about a king and what it is to be a king, and questions of royalty and inheritance and debt and the past. And so you definitely have your loose narrative, traditional sort of Moses, Simba narrative here, where it's about raising a king. And obviously that's a more of an analogy for the African people themselves to raise themselves up and to think of themselves as kings and to be proud in their heritage and where they come from. But, like I said, not to focus too much on the film itself, I want to talk about what this means for visual albums going forward. And so while most artists don't have the power that Beyonce does, I feel like we're probably going to see more artists follow in her footsteps when it comes to creating these sort of full-fledged visual albums, especially for streaming services that are always desperate for content. I mean, it's always an arms race between these companies. So if Disney Plus has a Beyonce visual album, I can't help but think Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Studios are going to each want their own as well. And just to give you a little history of the visual album, the concept is obviously not new. I mean, think of Hard Day's Night, which was a kind of a dumb Beatles film when the Beatles used to do movies to accompany all their albums. You also had like Pink Floyd's rock opera The Wall, which was released in 1982. And then Prince brought the story of the struggling artist to life with the film Purple Rain in 1984. Daft Punk with sort of their space anime film in 2003. And like I said, Beyonce released a visual album in 2013, and Lemonade was obviously a visual album in 2016. 2010, Kanye made most of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy into a 35-minute film called Runaway. And that debuted, I think, a month before the album even went on sale. And yeah, I mean, visual albums, they even come from earlier than that when you look at films like with The Jazz Singer, which was the first talkie, released in 1927, I believe. I mean, Elvis was a movie star the same year he emerged as a rock star. And soundtracks to musicals dominated pop charts just as much as studio albums in the 60s, early 60s. It's also a technique by which artists can sort of bypass traditional media or journalists to communicate directly with their fans without the middleman of an interview or a traditional cover story in like Vanity Fair or Rolling Stone or the New York Times. Dictating that we experience their new albums first in a visual medium, all three are replacing cover stories with text of their own. Now the three would be Frank Ocean, Kanye, and Beyonce, who've done the visual album, explored it at times. And it's a way for them to also safeguard their own works and kind of decide how they want it to be digested and analyzed, because they can sort of guide you in a sort of direction that they want you to look at the album in. Like Black is King, we are going to emphasize Pan-Africanist thought, philosophy, and most importantly, imagery. That way you associate those songs with those ideas, where without the visual album, maybe you're listening to The Gift. Maybe you're thinking of Lion King, the movie from the 2000s or the late 90s, whenever it came out, instead of the Beyonce version. That's a way you can think about the power of the visual album. It allows the artist to control the way you interpret the film, the way you interpret the music, the way you think about the music. So it's very, very powerful in that sense. And like I said, for these streaming platforms, it presents opportunities for them to increase their catalog for consumers and provide them with more of an incentive to subscribe, because places like Netflix, Hulu, it's all about increasing subscriptions. And I'm sure you'll see the Netflixes and the Amazons even fit the bill for these things. They'll be like, just throw money at it for the interest of attracting the prestige and the fan base that comes with these sort of musical cultural figures of the ilk that are like Beyonce. Whoever else is in that realm, that's who they're going to be targeting. But the visual album does have some downsides, which is if you're telling your audience how to feel, that sort of takes the agency out of being a consumer, out of being a active listener of music, because it always feels like something that should rely on ambiguity, allow the listener to draw meaning from their own life with the help of an outside voice, whether that's a singer, whether that's instrumentation. It's really important that the audience is able to sort of subscribe their own meaning to it. That gives them a sense of control and purpose when they're listening to music, where if you're sort of telling them how to feel about the songs, how to feel about the album, that sort of takes that control away. And I'm not necessarily in favor of one or the other, but I think that is a legitimate criticism of the visual album. And just to wrap things up, while most of the high-profile visual albums we've seen, especially Beyonce's efforts, are overwhelmingly expensive, I mean, it's basically the visual album version of the big-budget film, that implies that there should also be a space for the indie visual album, in the sense of like the cash-strapped indies that we're accustomed to in Hollywood, that sort of provide an alternative to the Michael Bays and the big summer blockbusters. Like, we all love our kitschy little indie teen films or little dramas that are released independently without the major studios. So I feel like if that's possible in Hollywood, that should be possible when it comes to visual albums, if that is indeed the future, which I believe it is, because the barrier to entry now is so low when you consider everyone has access to a camera and editing technology all in their pocket. Like, all you need is a group of friends, a semi-coherent narrative. Like, it doesn't even have to be that coherent because it's music. And just play music over the scenes, and you have a basic sense of a visual album there. Add a talented writer or a visionary director, and you could create the visual album version of an indie darling. You could create the visual album Juno. You could create the visual album Lady Bird. That is the future of visual albums if they become the norm, which, as genres mold together and multimedia becomes the norm, I feel like the visual album is going to come together as well as a more traditional way of packaging albums and providing experiences for your fans. So I'm really excited to see where the visual album goes. Obviously, check out Black is King. That is the high point of visual albums. I don't think we've approached anything when it comes to this level of investment and extravagance in any sort of visual album capacity. Maybe Purple Rain was the closest, but this is certainly the most bombastic, Great Gatsby-esque. Just, it is pure excess, but not in a bad way. It's just in a way to express Beyonce's vision fully and completely, and it certainly does. And I'm really excited to see what artists who aren't of the level of Beyonce but have visions themselves can do with the visual album platform. And like I said, watch out for Netflix, Amazon, Hulu. They're gonna come after these visual album ideas as well. Okay, after the break, we're gonna get into Dominic Fike. Just released his much-awaited debut album. We're going to talk about what we think about it, what it means for his future. So stick around for that.
Always on the go, but the day just won't be one without your Hollywood fix. Let Golden State Media Concepts Entertainment Podcast take care of that. An all-inclusive look of pop culture.
Welcome back to the GSMC Music Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Like I said, we're going to be talking about Dominic Fike's new record, What Could Possibly Go Wrong? Well, what I'm going to say is some stuff did sort of go wrong, to be honest with you. And I'm going to connect this to the idea of perceived stardom and how we judge work or production, whether it's in sports or music, based on your perceived talent and the hype surrounding you and what our expectations are for you after that. So there's going to be some references to Ricky Rubio, Andrew Wiggins. If you don't know who those people are, it's okay. You're still going to get my point across. If you do know who Ricky Rubio and Andrew Wiggins are, thank you for joining this Venn diagram of music and the NBA. It will pay off, I promise you. And if it doesn't, well, let's just hope I dazzled you with my thesis anyways. To start off, what could possibly go wrong? It's the debut studio album by American singer and rapper Dominic Fike, released at the end of July 31st. Fike had begun hinting at the album early 2019. He released the singles Acai Bowl, Rollerblades, Phone Numbers with Kenny Beats, and Hit Me Up with Omar Apollo and Mr. Officer Kenny Beats. Again, on June 26th, he had released Chicken Tenders, which was the lead single from the album. Then on July 9th, he announced that the album would be titled What Could Possibly Go Wrong and would be released on July 31st. He also released the second single, Politics and Violence. Now, if you don't know Dominic Fike, let me introduce you to this opening paragraph from his profile in The New Yorker in 2019. It reads, "The most important thing to know about Dominic Fike, a 23-year-old musician from Florida, is that someday soon, he'll be very famous. If you haven't yet heard of him, you will not be able to stop hearing about him or hearing his music in 6 months or a year. At least that's the party line of the music industry, which has hung an extraordinary amount of hope on a young star with about 15 minutes of officially streamable music. Fike is a precarious, photogenic artist with edgy face tattoos and sufficient talent. More important, he embodies the hazy, genre-less future of popular music. That is a perfect starting point for Dominic Fike. So, he is not just a new and up-and-coming artist. He was the preordained next big thing by the music industry. I mean, he was the one that they were hanging their hats on when it comes to appealing to Gen Z, which is obviously the new market that all these record labels are trying to attract as Gen Z comes into their own age. And what she talks about when she says he only had about 15 minutes of officially streamable music, well, he had released some songs on SoundCloud, singles here or there, and released a demo tape that was kind of big on SoundCloud. And that was all scrubbed from the internet, creating a dearth of actual material that you could listen to from Dominic Fike. It was like 15 minutes at one point because just nothing existed. And despite that, there was a huge bidding war between labels to sign him off his tiny, tiny amounts of material because what they saw in him was the next big thing, which we'll get into why they saw that in him. What about Dominic Fike appeal to the music industry? Just to give you a sense of what they saw in him, this is from a Columbia A&R rep. He said, quote, "They knew this was a catalog artist at stake. This may not come along for another 10 years. So the music industry looked at Dominic Fike and said, this guy is a potential catalog artist. He's going to produce legacy projects that not only are commercially successful but critically acclaimed, bringing prestige and money to the record companies." And that demo tape had a song on it, and that song was called 3 Nights. Now, if you're not familiar with 3 Nights, just to give you a sense of how big this song was at one point, it ended up on Obama's official year-end playlist for 2019 of songs that he had been listening to throughout the year. His favorite songs of 2019. Dominic Fike, 3 Nights. It became a European giant. And as someone who traveled Europe in the summer of 2019, I can attest to you that that song was everywhere. Every Uber I got into was playing 3 Nights. Every bar would play 3 Nights. Lots of restaurants. You would just hear it everywhere. 3 Nights was the biggest song in Europe. Obviously crossed over to America. And that was sort of the song that launched him into superstardom. Not to mention a few of the other songs on that project, which were, I think there was only like 4 or 5 songs on that thing, were pretty well received as well. And inevitably, the 22-year-old artist hit the Spotify playlist circle. Like I said, racking up millions of plays on songs like 3 Nights and another big hit, Baby Doll. Glowing press followed. By the time Fike released his debut EP, which I mentioned, because Columbia, once they signed Fike, re-released the demos because they'd been scrubbed from the internet, so they re-released it. That's when it went off in Europe. That's when it went off on the internet. That's when it became a huge hit. By the time he'd released his debut in October, the buzz was palpable. Within days, his music was being praised on social media by suspiciously notable figures like DJ Khaled, and Kourtney Kardashian. The attention seemed dangerously premature, as though Fike's superstardom was a foregone conclusion and incidental to whatever music he ended up producing. Now that is from the New Yorker article as well. So, think of a guy, 15 minutes of music, comes from essentially nowhere. He's coming from Naples, Florida. He starts a bidding war, eventually gets $4 million advance before he released any music. $4 million he gets before he released any music because of the potential that the music industry saw in this kid. And you get people like Kourtney Kardashian and DJ Khaled shouting you out, like, just as the music's being released. And unsurprisingly, a lot of people said his success does seem preordained. It's almost as if he's a quote-unquote industry plant, which is obviously the myth that the music industry creates these false origin stories for artists who pretend they're indie and struggling, but really been cultivated by the music industry to blow up. Now, it's kind of unclear whether he is an industry plant. Depends on your persuasion, how conspiratorial you are, but you can see why there's the material to think this kid was an industry plant. In his defense, he says, nah, I'm just a talented dude, just making music. And as Rolling Stone wrote, in many ways, it's easy to see why people, power brokers included, are drawn to him. He's a low-stakes rebel, a pinchably Instagram-ready face complete with tattoos a suburban mom would shriek at. Musically, he's an amalgamation that sounds complicated. Kevin Abstract's heart-on-sleeve biographical bars, Jack Johnson's beach bum vibes, Frank Ocean's lyrical non-sequiturs, and the aforementioned Malone's moody melodies, but really just feels like easy listening designed for the streaming age. So, he sort of is that post Malone era where you're looking for these guys who can dip their toes in rock, folk, pop, hip-hop, sort of genreless, but appeals to the streaming age and Gen Z in particular, who has the least allegiance to any sort of one genre or the other. And that is, like I said, the big selling point to Gen Z in the minds of the music industry, because he's kind of reviving skate and surf bro rock, but delivering it through this modern hip-hop lens. And in this time where privacy is less and less common, the way he deleted all his music from the internet, that version of scarcity made him mysterious and exciting and alluring, not only to the music industry, but music fans as well. And, you know, he's got multiple face tattoos, which is probably the strongest aesthetic signifier among rising hip-hop stars. He's basically the logical progression from, like I said, Post Malone, who's making this savvy blend of pop, blues, rock, and rap, but is basically classified as hip-hop because of his aesthetic image. And Fike really is a symbol, I guess, up until the pandemic happened, of the music business's newfound momentum. You know, 5 years ago, the music industry was in a rut, but his $4 million deal shows that in this post-streaming golden age for the music industry, that is possible now, and Fike is basically this blank slate that the music industry can paint and project their fantasies about the future onto. Now, the problem is, after all that hype, after the songs with Kenny Beats, after the songs with Brock Hampton, after his own demo tapes with songs like 3 Nights, people were expecting the world from this kid. He was the next big thing. And the thing is, the album, it's just okay. I'm not saying it's bad. It's definitely not bad. It's not even close to bad, but it's not close to great either. And unfairly or not, we have to judge Dominic Fike on a curve because he's had all this hype and all this investment behind him. So we can't judge him like any other artist. We have to judge him through the lens of what the musical industrial complex has put behind him. And in that respect, it feels like it's just massively, massively underwhelming. I mean, as Rolling Stone wrote, the problem is that these inoffensive songs are made by a singer that doesn't seem too keen on the product he's selling. The album does kind of have this sense of Fike is kind of overwhelmed by his newfound fame, crippled by the pressure he feels from those relying on him, and sort of fantasizes about it all going away, especially on songs like Cancel Me, which we'll get to later, which isn't necessarily bad material for a project. I mean, that a lot of artists have turned that into great material. But here it results in a sound that often feels frustrated and unsure of itself. And for an artist with such high expectations and hype, it's not disastrous, but it's disappointing. There's no way to get around it. It's really disappointing. When Obama's shouting you out, we're going to be expecting some type of level of music that he doesn't really deliver here. Now, the songwriting isn't particularly strong. The rapping comes and goes. The songs themselves are oftentimes a little generic, and ultimately his voice, his point of view, isn't really that distinct. And like I said, I know this may sound a little unfair to someone's first album, but this isn't just anyone. This was supposed to be the next star. He was the next it boy. He was the Gen Z prophet. Turns out maybe that was premature. Maybe that was the music industry not reading the room totally correctly, which, knowing the music industry, that is definitely within their wheelhouse. And to get to the songs themselves, look at ones like Good Game, which start well but sort of run into these dead ends. Others like Why and Come Here feel incomplete. The catalog of the songs here are just nothing's particularly memorable. Nothing's particularly repeat nature to it. Repeat potential there. It's just sort of meandering, and I don't think he really had a vision for this album. It's sort of you ride the moods and the emotion that Fike goes through as he's being catapulted into fame, which is interesting, but he doesn't find a way to deliver it in the most captivating fashion. And then you have songs like Cancel Me, which is sort of a wrong-headed choice. Like, look, it's a song about the feeling of wanting to return to his family and to go back to normal life, which is a relatable feeling. But the vessel through which he delivers this is super weird and frankly just cringeworthy. I mean, he says, I hope they banish me. I miss my family tree. I was a family man and now I'm just a man to see. If you can't pay your rent or be responsible financially, they need you. I hope I get me too'd. What? I hope I get me too'd? That, I'm telling you, that lyric's not going to age well. It doesn't even play well right now. It's only going to get worse in the future. Honestly, where was the Columbia executives to be like, dude, that lyric, that's not kosher, man. That's not great. It's not clever. It's just dumb. It's really dumb. Politics and Violence shapes up to be a good song, but sort of suffers from a confusing beat transition that sort of taints the song. Though, I gotta say, on the third, fourth listens, it's sort of growing on me, but still just like, why'd you make that choice? And then you have songs like Vampire, which is actually a highlight of the record because it's feels like Dominic Fike at his most confident. It's a pop-friendly radio banger. And it's kind of clever. Mixes this vampire metaphor where red wine might be blood and everyone is doing drugs. It works. And it's kind of removed from the otherwise dour and anxious songs elsewhere on the album. He sort of revels in playing the radio-friendly star on that song, but elsewhere he seems more encumbered by it, unhappy about it. And, I mean, it's, like I said, just underwhelming. He may be the world's next crossover star, Rendier, which means, my criticism doesn't really matter. It's beside the point. But he's just not there yet. And for his first full-length album to underwhelm like this, it's not a great sign going forward. And to bring it full circle here, I did mention Ricky Rubio and Andrew Wiggins, and I can't help but think Dominic Fike's hype and all the media attention, the glowing press, all the headlines about he's going to be the next star, he's the next Billie Eilish, he's Gen Z's prophet. It reminds me of hyped draft prospects or Olympic athletes who have yet to be on the big stage. Anyone who's up and coming in the sports world, whether that's NBA, NFL, any sport, there's always this surrounding hype behind some of these guys, and they don't all pan out. And to me, he reminds me a lot of Ricky Rubio and Andrew Wiggins, respectively. Now, Ricky Rubio, if you're not aware of him, he is a guard for the Phoenix Suns, and his career has been underwhelming because he was this top 10 lottery pick, literally supposed to be the next Pete Maravich. He was this guard from Spain who was dominating EuroLeague and was like a superstar in Spain, celebrity, and the best European prospect to come along since like Dirk Nowitzki or something. And while he's not had a bad career, he's not been great either. He's not been the next Pete Maravich, to say the least. I don't think he's made an all-star team. Maybe an all-defensive team, I'm not sure. He's not a bad player. He's one of the better passers in the NBA. He's got a great mind for the game, but he can't shoot. And he's not become the superstar that we all thought he was going to be. And the same thing you could say about someone like Andrew Wiggins, who was this Canadian superstar, literally called Maple Jordan. His highlights were all over YouTube, dunking over everyone. And he gets drafted, I think he was the number 1 or number 2 pick. And he's not panned out at all. He is nowhere close to meeting the potential of a Michael Jordan, let alone even a good NBA player. He's a merely average. He's had flashes of brilliance, but ultimately it's never come together. I know this is a sort of messy analogy, and maybe I'm losing you on the basketball here, but my point is, a lot of time the media and just fans in general and the experts, so to say, decide this guy is the next it boy. He's the next one to move music or sports forward. He's going to be the next star, because nothing excites us like finding the next star. We all want to be the one to find the next star and see someone's rise from the beginning. But if you force it, it doesn't always work. And with Fike here, he's got a lot of talent. I really like some of his songs. I think he's got a interesting style and amalgamation of different genres that I really find appealing. But I don't think he's elite at one particular aspect of music. Just like Ricky Rubio, Andrew Wiggins, you're not really elite at any one thing. You're good or okay at a lot, but you're not elite. And we expected you to be an elite artist, an elite athlete, and you just didn't deliver. And it's no fault of their own. I feel bad for Fike. He didn't ask for any of this hype. Same with athletes. They don't ask for any of the hype, but it comes anyways. And they're forced to live in that shadow. And sometimes it doesn't always work. And Fike, it doesn't really work here. But there's some nice cuts on the album regardless. But For the hype we expected from him, not delivering. I'm not seeing it. He's got a long, long way to go. Let's see if he delivers on his second album. After the break, we're going to get into the third segment. We're going to be talking about what's on my shuffle playlist. Stick around for that. And at the end of the show, we will be doing musical what ifs. You're really going to want to hear that. So please stick around.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Music Podcast. Now, I told you we're going to talk about what's on my shuffle. Now, just to give you an idea of the thoughts behind this segment, it is basically where I talk about random songs that come up on my personal Spotify shuffle. I did not plan for this beforehand. I simply gathered a group of songs, I click shuffle, and I wrote some thoughts down about each one of the songs that came up on shuffle. Now, they could be new songs, they can be old songs, they can be weird songs, they can be bad songs, they can be good songs, but it is shuffle in its purest form, so let's get into it. Number one song that came up on my shuffle. First song that came up, Soon I'll Be Loving You Again, Marvin Gaye, classic. Quite a naughty song, not gonna lie to you. Don't play that too loudly if you're in public. But it's dancey. It's just great romantic song. It's Marvin Gaye at his peak. It's from the 1976 album, I Want You. Great production. I love the, I think it's like bongo drums or something on this. It's really great. It's just classic. Check that song out. Marvin Gaye, the GOAT. Second song that came up on my shuffle could not be any different. It's called Confused by Future and Gucci Mane, a.k.a. East Atlanta Santa. From 2013's World War III Volume 1 Lean project by Zaytoven, Gucci Mane, and I think Mike Will Made It was also on that. This song has one of my favorite Zaytoven beats, who, obviously, if you don't listen to Zaytoven, he is known for his piano-based beats, basically piano, synth, maybe some 808s. Gucci Mane often works with him. He works with a lot of rappers in Atlanta and around the South, but he is actually a San Francisco native, connection to my hometown that I'm quite proud of. But yeah, this is one of my favorite beats. It sounds like an ice cream truck pulling up to a drug bust. That's the best way I could describe it. It's fantastic. And Future and Gucci just dropping some great verses full of nefarious bad advice. Just a great bad guy character persona verses from both of them. Very, very much a repeatable track. If you're into Gucci Mane, if you're into Future, If you're into a fun little piano-driven song, this is one for you. Third song, Woodlawn, off the new Amine album, Limbo. I think this album came out 4 days ago. It's very, very new. This is, I think, the second track off of it. I really like the album. This is a great, catchy kind of slapper, you know? It's in the slapper territory. And it's got a nice flute sample, which sort of reminds me of Portland by Drake featuring, I think it was Quavo or maybe All the Migos. If you remember that from his More Life album, which he did not call an album, he called a playlist, which was just the most pretentious thing ever. Thank you, Drake. But yeah, it reminds me of the flute on Portland, which makes sense because Amine, Portland native. You see that working together right there? That's poetry. Next song that came up on my shuffle, Love in Vain by the Rolling Stones. This is one of my favorite blues covers that the Rolling Stones ever did. So much emotion in this. And like they say about rock and roll, you always go back to the blues whenever you don't know what to do because that is what the genre is rooted in. And they do that here on a cover of blues legend Robert Johnson. If you don't know, Robert Johnson kind of looked at as the most mythical, if not greatest, blues guitarist of all time. He was so good that legend had it that he sold his soul to the devil to get the talent to play the guitar the way he did because he was so good. People said, there's some witchcraft with how good he is at that. And not only with the guitar, his lyrics, which the Rolling Stones use verbatim here, are just so heartbreaking and so brilliant. Robert Johnson, if you're not familiar with him, check out his work and check out his biography. He died tragically young, but was just one of those comets across the sky. Brilliant. Didn't last long, but boy, did he shine bright when he was out there. And yeah, it's a bit more country on this version with the Rolling Stones. They made it a bit more country. Very sad. Apparently Keith and Mick had adapted it after a surprise release in 1967 because there were only like 4 Robert Johnson songs available. And then I guess a few more got released. There's very limited amount of Robert Johnson songs out there, but Love in Vain, one of my favorite, most heartbreaking tracks by Robert Johnson, and the Stones do it justice, big time. That's off Beggar's Banquet, I believe, which is a great Stones album. Next song that came up, Deadbeat Holiday by Green Day. Honestly, this is a shuffle when songs you didn't know you had saved end up playing. That's the beauty of shuffle. That's the curse of shuffle. Now, I feel like personally I've sort of outgrown Green Day. What I found nice about the pop punk sort of sound to it, even though maybe pop punk is a bit unfair to Green Day, but let's be honest, guys, it's radio-friendly punk rock, has sort of gone out of my taste pack, what I like to listen to. It's not really one I revisit a lot these days. But Deadbeat Holiday is not a bad song, and I forget which album this is off actually, but I think it's like their 5th or 6th album. It's not bad. And this song, it's catchy. Something to play up if you're feeling angsty, I guess. Next song, Shut Up by Stormzy. This is a grime classic. I think it was released in like 2015. You get a great call and response sort of track. The backing crew he has, especially in the YouTube video, is just hilarious with their refrains. Yeah, I feel like this is a good introductory track actually to grime if you're not familiar with it. It's sort of a offshoot of hip-hop and house music and trip-hop that took off in London, especially East London. And Stormzy is one of the bigger acts in that whole grime scene. It's like up-tempo, really high BPM beats, and traditional sort of rapping very fast, very aggressive. Check it out. And Stormzy, yeah, if you're not familiar with him, check out his catalog. He's a pretty big name, not only the UK, but just internationally. Grime is kind of blown up. Next song, Dead to Me by Kali Uchis. Kali Uchis is one of my favorite singers in the game right now. She has so much character and personality to her voice. She's sort of like this 1920s jazz singer who's been thrust into space, dropped in 2020 with all the great bedroom pop and hip-hop and R&B sounds we have in the present day. And she rides it, especially with her bilingual dynamics. It's just a great package that she brings to the table. She's such a great artist. And Dead to Me is one of her best breakup songs, I feel like. It's definitely in bop territory. Great synths on this. I really like the lyrics too. Quite clever. As danceable for sure. And that's off her first album, Isolation, which is another classic. Definitely urge you to check out if you're not familiar with Kali Uchis, but you probably are. She's a pretty big name. Shower the People by James Taylor was another one that came up on my shuffle. This is soft rock, easy listening, sunny day sort of music. Very positive message. Something you can play with your dad or your mom in the car. Everyone's feeling good. Everyone's enjoying life. Good song. James Taylor. Big fan. It's just it's like cake or a piece of chocolate. It just pleases everybody across the spectrum. Next one, All at Once by Whitney Houston. Heartbreak ballad off her debut album. Very 80s slow motion sort of instrumentals on this. I feel like the music behind it is sort of disappointing, but her voice, it's Whitney Houston, so it's strong. It's beautiful, full of personality, full of vitality, especially with her first album when she's just breaking it big. Whitney Houston, the queen herself, great song. Next one, The Basement by Pete Rock, CL Smooth, and Heavy D. This is a classic album and a classic track off a classic album, Mecca and the Soul Brother. It's a hip-hop head classic, too. This is boom-bap, 90s golden age sort of stuff. Hip-hop at its roots, really, with just, you get a sample, you get drums underneath it, and you get very easy to follow, clever wordplay. Sampled Sister Nancy, who's a Jamaican dancehall singer, her song Bam Bam. Really great use of a sample. I think it was also sampled by Lauryn Hill on Miseducation. And we also get a Heavy D feature, who was, 80s hip-hop legend, one of the biggest stars of 80s hip-hop when it was first starting to break free. And Heavy D, his verse isn't fantastic. It's a little short for my taste on this, but it's great. You also get Roads by Portishead. That's a track from Portishead's debut album. It's just goth rock, alternative, spacey track. Feels like music made for Ghost. It's like gothic hip-hop. Part of that whole British trip-hop tradition that started in Bristol, I believe. Portishead, always interesting to listen to. Then, following that, I got Always Alright by Alabama Shakes, which was nominated for Best Rock Performance at the 2014 Grammys. Dancey Southern rock with catchy guitar riffs from the Silver Linings Playbook soundtrack. And I don't know if you guys remember that movie with Jennifer Lawrence and Bradley Cooper. Personally, I thought it was a bit of a mess, but that album and that movie, I think, did pretty damn well. This song, though, great highlight. Love Alabama Shakes. Brittany Howard is just such a talent. We also have Sane by Green Tea Pang, I believe. Groovy as hell. It's basically this hip-hop, neo-soul fusion with kind of some jazzy refrains and haziness. It's just a great groovy track to dance to Watch a live performance of this. I think it's a Boiler Room set in London. Just type in Greedy, Pang, Sane, Boiler Room. Great little video. Gives you the energy, just comes through on that one. Then I click next. What I get? Waves, Miguel, Tame Impala remix. Great Kevin Parker remix. You get Miguel's crooning mixing perfectly with Tame Impala. Basically color palette. That's the best way I can describe that sound. It feels like colors. Psychedelic euphoria. Parker, his backing vocals on this are just heavenly. Excellent bass line. And if you're not familiar with Waves by Miguel, I think he remixed with 2 other artists. Another one was Casey Musgraves. I like that remix as well. Check that out. Night Ride by the Growlers. Perfect mix of synths and a grooving bass with vivid songwriting. It feels like you're in the middle of a random out-of-town motel between LA and Vegas or something. This was produced by Julian Casablancas, lead singer of The Strokes. You can definitely see the influence there. Yeah, this is a perfect song to describe kind of waking up in the middle of a party. You don't know where you are, who you're with. Kind of hedonism captured perfectly. Just a great, great song. We also have Gentleman by the legend Afrobeat co-creator Fela Kuti, the Nigerian cultural force himself. It's off the album of the same name. And it basically skewers colonial mindsets of not only the people, but the government. This is a 14-minute jam of Afrobeat danciness, James Brown showmanship, political commentary, jazz sections, rock and roll hedonism, and hip-hop confidence. It's just the whole package. I love Fela Kuti. If you have not listened to Fela Kuti, I don't know why you're listening to this right now. Just stop the podcast and go listen to some Fela Kuti. He is amazing. Following Gentleman followed up with another great track, Little White Dove by Jenny Lewis, off her album that came out, I think 2 years ago now. On the Line, stuttered drums, meandering bass provide the pages for Lewis to pen her fantastic lyrics. This one's about a mother-daughter relationship, and On the Line, one of my favorite albums of the last 5 years. Jenny Lewis is a genius. Then I also had Old Yellow Bricks by Arctic Monkeys, one of my all-time favorite bands. This is off their second album, Favorite Worst Nightmare. Nice little references to Wizard of Oz here. Then, the Yellow Brick Road, Old Yellow Bricks. You get a piercing guitar, forceful drums, and Alex Turner just being a rock star. And you get the fantastic refrain of this song. Who wants to sleep in a city that never wakes up, blinded by nostalgia? Who wants to sleep in a city that never wakes up? Well, that provides a framework for the song that is ultimately about leaving your hometown to find the big city, achieve your dreams there, and only to find that, you know what, the great big city's not all it's cracked up to be. Lastly, I See Your Face Before Me by Frank Sinatra. It's a cover of the song of the same name from the Broadway musical Between the Devil. It's off his 1955 album In the Wee Small Hours, which is one of Sinatra's greatest albums and music's best loneliness-themed album, in my opinion. It's bittersweet, full of longing. The album is a concept, feels like a collection of short stories. It feels like literature, honestly. It's just a jazz and blues masterpiece with Sinatra at his absolute peak. Fantastic. We're going to take a break, but on the other side, we're going to be talking about what ifs of music history. Stick around for that.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the show, the GSMC Music Show. Now, like I told you, we're going to talk about music what ifs. Everyone loves some good alternate history. What if the Nazis won? What if JFK didn't die? What if? Well, you can do that with music too. And so, let's go down a rabbit hole of alternative history that we can never fully experience, nor ever fully dispute, because it's pure speculation. But everyone has one alternate music thought, I'm sure. Number one that I'm going to start with here. How would American music have sounded if not for the Vietnam War? Vietnam, the whole conflict, the whole era, so think of basically the middle to late 60s to the middle 70s was defined by the Vietnam War. It spanned multiple presidential administrations, spanned multiple military strategies. It morphed from one war into another. Obviously became a draft at one point, which really made it a controversial part of American history. Now, consider that much of the 20th century's most defining pop music emerged from this period. And it's really interesting to consider, if you take out the Vietnam War, what does music sound like? Because so much of the music we hold in high regard from the middle 20th century, so much of how we perceive rock and roll is kind of in relation to the Vietnam War and the sense of rebellion and challenging the status quo and questioning authority and looking towards not politicians but towards yourself and inner peace and spiritual, all that sort of stuff that came out of the 60s hippie movement and anti-war movements and civil rights movements to a degree as well. Because, before the Vietnam War, American society had experienced protest music, especially, like I mentioned, with the civil rights movement in the late 50s and early 60s. But while folk, rock, and psychedelia created the sound of an era for white America, black soul and blues artists also continued their own path against the social tumult of the 60s and 70s. Artists such as Marvin Gaye brought Motown and other R&B labels into the political sphere with records like 1971 released What's Going On, the title track of which became this symbol of the era and has lyrics like, "Father, Father, we don't need to escalate. You see, war is not the answer, for only love can conquer hate." Now that's speaking to the black experience because Marvin Gaye and it's Motown, but that also could be felt by the country as a whole, because if it wasn't delivered in the same way Marvin Gaye was saying it, white rock stars like Crosby, Stills and Nash, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and others were creating their own protest songs about the Vietnam War and about the draft and about the inequities and immoral nature of it. So to think of what rock and roll even defines itself against without the Vietnam War. I mean, don't get me wrong, rock music existed before the Vietnam War, it existed after the Vietnam War. But I don't think it's necessarily the same because so much of the political edge and the mythic golden age of the late 60s, early 70s rock and roll periods were kind of in light of the Vietnam War and the conflict and the draft and the protests and the social movements that were all a part of it, especially because a lot of these musicians were deeply involved in activism and in trying to promote their own ideologies and their own political opinions when it came to this stuff and what they wanted the listener to do. So is music in general less political? Is it less biting? Is it less mistrustful of authority and the status quo? Is it more supportive of the U.S. government? Is it less anti-war in some degree? That's a really interesting question to ask, and I think soldiers themselves really relied on music to keep them grounded to their home, to the States, to where they came from, and music became this sort of unifying force in that sense as well. So it's interesting to think of, without that war, are certain songs as big as they become? I mean, you have songs like Paint It Black by the Rolling Stones that aren't made for Vietnam, but in every Vietnam documentary, they're playing that. Or in the Buffalo Springfield track, oh man, that's escaping me right now actually, but they have a song that's actually about a riot on Sunset Boulevard over a curfew. So this had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, but it became a song because of the lyrics in it that inadvertently, For What It's Worth, sorry, had to find the name for that song, that inadvertently became a protest song for the Vietnam War. So even the songs that weren't trying to be protest songs, weren't trying to define that, it becomes a part of the fabric because the Vietnam War was such a defining feature of the 60s, of what it meant to be a hippie, what it meant to be countercultural, what it meant to listen to rock and roll. I mean, I know I keep talking about rock and roll, but like we mentioned earlier, it was also Motown, it was also folk, it was also jazz. It was all across the board, all across American society, that the anti-war movement was a major factor in music at the time. So to imagine a world without that, it's not necessarily better, it's not necessarily worse, but it's hard to know what music looks like without the tumult and the chaos of the 70s and late 60s, which is defined by the Vietnam War. Another great what if. What if Jimi Hendrix lived? What if he didn't OD? What if he lived? What if he was still alive today? Now, it's pretty well known that Jimi Hendrix was looking to branch out and make some major stylistic changes not long before his death in 1970. It's also pretty well known that Hendrix and trumpet master Miles Davis were making plans to work together in a new project. Miles Davis, obviously jazz legend. They even sent a telegram to Paul McCartney asking him to join them on bass. And the telegram read, "We are recording an LP together this weekend in New York. How about coming to play in bass? Peace, Jimi Hendrix, Miles Davis, and their drummer Tony Williams." Apparently Paul McCartney was away on vacation that day, but can you imagine if we had gotten a Paul McCartney, Jimi Hendrix, Miles Davis album? I mean, that's like Thanos getting all the Infinity Stones. That is the musical Infinity Stones. That would be a rock orgasm of, I don't know, any of us would ever recover from. The amount of brilliance that would have created. That alone is so seductive to think about when it comes to if Jimi Hendrix didn't die, if he was still here. I mean, that probably would have been one of his career-defining projects, especially moving on past the 60s into the 70s. That could have been a start and provided all this momentum for the next phase of his career. I think also he would have gone pretty psychedelic and funky as funk was coming out with Parliament Funkadelic. I'm sure he had some friendships with George Clinton or Bootsy Collins, or at least not friendships, knew someone who knew them. Like, the degrees of separation in the music world are not such that I feel like Jimi Hendrix would not have gotten into that. Especially with how cutting edge and experimental it was. Jimi Hendrix is an experimental sort of artist. I think he would have loved to work with Parliament Funkadelic and just the funk movement in general. He definitely knew Sly Stone as well, who was obviously Sly and Family Stone, which was at the forefront of funk. So if he didn't work with Parliament Funkadelic, I think he's working with Sly. That would have been amazing. Imagine Jimmy's guitar with those funky bass lines and just the whole aesthetic of funk at the time. Oh my god. Oh my god. Incredible to think about. Also think about, what if Miles Davis introduced Jimi Hendrix to Herbie Hancock, who could have hired him for his record Headhunters, which is like top 5 jazz records of all time. That record is pure brilliance, and if you add Jimi Hendrix on it, they might play that in outer... Like, if aliens ever came, they should play that, if that had ever happened. And, like, going into the 80s, does Jimi Hendrix play guitar on something like Thriller? Just, play the little shredding guitar in the background. Does he start working with Prince, who we know Prince borrowed so much of his style and musical sensibilities from Jimi Hendrix? I could really see them collaborating together, making some great music. In a way, Prince was the artist who sort of revived the Jimi Hendrix aesthetic, and I don't know if he was as good a guitarist as Jimi Hendrix, but he was damn close. So to imagine them working together, that would have created some just lasting, incredible works of art. Also, think about the grunge movement in the 1990s. Think of bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. Prince, as we know, Prince, Jimi Hendrix, Seattle native. Does he go back to Seattle to work with Kurt Cobain? Does he go back to work with Eddie Vedder? Is Jimi Hendrix getting acclimated in that scene as sort of the older, wiser, talent who kind of guides all those grunge bands with the music industry and how to navigate everything and be a big brother, be a father figure almost to those guys? That would have been amazing. Think of Jimi Hendrix collaborating with Kurt Cobain, that's almost more appealing than the Prince thing. I mean, they're both amazing in different ways. I could really see Jimmy just shredding on some of those guitars, especially on In Utero and stuff, where they really just let it go. Oh my god, that would have been amazing, and it would have made sense because it's Seattle, the Seattle bond. That would have been great. Also, knowing the way artists age, it easily could have gone badly. Maybe Jimi Hendrix gets fat and bald and uncreative and starts making music for commercials and Pepsi and Coca-Cola and doing halftime shows and stuff. It doesn't necessarily go well. I'm sure it's not that neat. I'm sure he disappoints and doesn't really always make the greatest musical choices. But that's just kind of the deal of getting older as an artist. I mean, even Bob Dylan's done commercials, right? No one's above it. most importantly, though, I think he could have been a real cultural symbol, countercultural symbol, political leader. He was getting more political as his career went on. Obviously, him playing the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock became this great anti-Vietnam War analogy. And songs like Machine Gun, where he's basically playing the guitar like the sounds of war. He could have been a great figure of the anti-war movement, the protest movement, moving on into the Black Power movement, and just as a countercultural force and provide a platform for leftist thought and countercultural thought. That would have been really interesting to see if Jimi Hendrix, as not just a musical icon, but sort of this cultural icon as well, as he was kind of slowly becoming towards the end of his life. Well, those are my 2 musical what-ifs. We will have more, because it's such a fun segment to talk about. Thank you for tuning into the show. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Music Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. Really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you. Have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.